As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Welcome back to another episode of The Malcolm Effect with Mamadou. Today, it is going to be a topic that is long overdue on this podcast with Dr. Professor Helyeh Doutaghi. Welcome for the first time, and it won't be the last time, to The Malcolm Effect.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
No, it's an absolute pleasure for me, honestly. I had the unfortunate experience of meeting you at the ISA earlier this year, and I think with our anti-imperialist caucus gave me the necessary, it restored my sanity knowing that there are academics who actually think on these lines, who are actually committed and principled to anti-imperialist theorizations and praxis. But it seems like you can say anything you want about Iran and people will believe it. You can say anything you want about Iran. You can take the most unprincipled stances towards Iran. You can take a reactionary stance to Iran. You can say Iran is banning this, and people will say, but what about these people? Center X voices. And I feel like unless you're addressing the primary antagonism and the primary contradiction, is that Iran is facing or has withstood the onslaught of US imperialism for near 40, 50 years now. And unless you're not centering that conversation, I think you miss everything. So in true online fashion, people like to hark back to this romantic time of the Shah and say, look at Islam, look at Iran prior to the Islamic Revolution.
The miniskirts.
The miniskirts, as if to say that somehow is evidence of progression, right?
And development.
So I want to speak. Talk to me briefly about Iran's transitions. The Shah, the socialism, the coup, the Islamic revelation. Give the audience a brief overview of these transitions if you can. Thank you.
Of course. I think it's crucial. Not being ahistorical in our analysis when we're talking about Iran would really help us understand and have an accurate develop an anti-imperialist analysis. And so to understand the current Iranian state, many people begin with the 79 revolution, which marked the establishment of the Islamic Republic. But to fully grasp the complex history which has led to the current moment, it really is essential to go further back. And I wouldn't say I'm going to go further back than Shah even. Before the revolution, Iran was under a series of monarchies, right, for centuries. But for our purposes, I think it's helpful to briefly talk about the Qajar dynasty, which reigned from 1789 to 1925. And then it was the Pahlavi dynasty, which lasted for about 60 years up to the revolution, the 79 revolution. And the reason I want to talk about Qajar dynasty, it began with Muhammad Khan Qajar and saw Iran under an immense pressure from colonial imperial powers, especially Russia and Britain. Iran was rather a buffer zone between the two empires, unable to protect its sovereignty in any shape or form. And because of that, it was invaded and faced a lot of military defeats, significant territorial loss to Russia in the early 19th century. And these defeats culminated in the very unequal colonial treaties like Golestan and Turkmenistan. I'm just mentioning these for people who want to do more research on their own. But what I want to get to is, in this context, the dynasty also experienced a lot of internal instability and rebellions and financial hardship. And so a lot of Iran's economic sovereignty and independence were undermined, right? The pivotal moment in Iran's history in this period was the Darcy concession in 1901. Qajar granted to William Knox Darcy, a British businessman, a special and exclusive privilege to search for, obtain, exploit, and pretty much trade, carry away, and sell natural gas, petroleum, asphalt, ozokera throughout the whole extent of the Persian Empire for the term of 60 years. So this happened during Qajar, and but around seven years later, in 1908, Darcy, for the first time ever in the history of Iran, Darcy engineers discovered oil in what was called Masjid Soleiman in the southwestern of Iran. And immediately the British government directly got involved to take control of Iran's natural resources and steal the wealth and exploit the oil. And I'm just saying this history in a very, like, I'm missing a lot of important details here, but to really, I guess, point it back to struggles for sovereignty and natural and independent and sovereignty over natural resources. By 1914, the British government had acquired a majority stake in that company, and they gave 16% of the company's profit annually to Iran, which we don't know how that was calculated. Iran had no power over that calculation and the numbers. And this was also in the context of the World Wars. And when Iran transitioned to the Pahlavi dynasty, Pahlavi, the father of the Shah, which was Reza Khan, was put in place in 1921 with an orchestrated coup with the British support. And so he found the Pahlavi dynasty in 1925, and he was an imperialist agent through and through. He attempted to modernize, quote unquote, Iran. He facilitated the exploitation of oil. The raw materials it was a Darcy, right? The Darcy concession was still in place, and it was happening. He was also very much under the influence of Ataturk. And after his visit to Turkey, if I'm not mistaken, he made the hijab illegal for women because he thought that was against the modernization of Iran. And so this was also happening in the background of the World Wars, right? The World War II specifically, the company was affected by the recessions, and the royalties were reduced a lot, I think to a quarter of the previous years. And so the Shah decided to cancel the concession, and he wanted to renegotiate because for the modernization programs that he was running, he needed more money, essentially. And so the cancellation of this represented a serious threat to the British government. So they decided to overthrow yet another Shah in Iran and decided to put in place Reza Shah, who's known as the Shah here, who's the son, right, and the last person to govern the Pahlavi dynasty. And so both the father and the son came into power as a direct result of British involvement and influence in the country. The Shah, the son, Mohammad Reza, came into power in 1941. And fast forward 10 years, in the context of a lot of decolonial struggles that were happening in the world, and especially in the global south at the time, Mossadegh led a movement. It was, in fact, a lot of organizing and a lot of a struggle by the Tudeh and a lot of labor movement struggles and left. But Mossadegh was essentially the head of this movement for sovereignty over national resources. And owed to decades of struggles, they successfully nationalized Iran's oil for the first time in history. It took about 2 years for MI6 and CIA to orchestrate yet another coup to overthrow Mossadegh in Operation Ajax. And this happened in 1953. So this joint British-American venture preserved the international oil charter, and it also paved the way for Mohammad Reza Shah to secure another 3 decades, which also meant that the Anglo-American influence over the country and its massive oil and gas supplies were secured for another 3 decades. So Iran, during that time, became one of the largest importers of weapons from the United States, particularly during the 70s. I'm talking about Iran military expenditure was Shah also really wanted to modernize like his father, expanded a lot of countries' wealth into armed forces, invested a lot of that into armed forces. And the period saw extensive armed deals between Iran and the US, including, aircraft, tanks, and other militaries, while there were no investment and no interest in any indigenous development, any industrial development in the country. And so, when I go for my research, I had to go back to a lot of archives and a lot of discussions in the Security Council. And what is fascinating is the presence of this unapologetic colonial narrative that is present in British delegates in the meetings and in the discussions, both at the Security Council and outside. And what they continuously argued was how they would say, oil in the ground is only a potential source of wealth. And since the Iranian government could not itself develop the oil, it was essential for the Iranian government to arrange for its development by foreigners. And it was a very unapologetic colonial logic that really sustained a lot of these colonial and imperialist attacks on Iran, although Iran was never formally colonized by any of these imperial powers, but the imperial aggression was sustained throughout these decades. And then we are led to 79 moment. So this takes us to 79 moment, right? A lot of historians, in fact, identify the 1953 coup as the legitimacy crisis for Shah that led to the 79 moment. Because 79, essentially what it did was it marked the end of foreign exploitation of Iran's wealth and national resources and the continued flow of capital from Iran to the US, British, and France. And the political influence and interference that they had in Iran, it shut that down, right? And so one could say that in 79, Iran completed what it couldn't do in 50, what was taken away from it in 59, in 51 by Mossadegh, and the foreign imperial domination of its sovereignty. And 79 was the moment where Iran could, for the first time, start to chart a path to development independent of foreign control. So it also meant, the 79 revolution also meant that Iran was no longer willing to act as the regional policeman, the way that Saudi Arabia, for instance, is playing that role today. Iran was doing a lot of that heavy lifting at the time, right, before the revolution. So Iran refused to do this and be the regional policeman of the imperial countries, primarily because it participated directly in disturbing that order with its new mode of governance and under the Islamic Republic, and also the ideologies that accompanied it. And I know you've had incredible guests like Bikram and others who have talked about the resistance and how Iran has contributed to this. We can talk about that later, but I don't want to get into that. But a lot of both material and ideological underpinnings of the 79 revolution was a direct threat to the order that Iran was the order that run the region and the imperial order that run West Asia. And so that was disturbed. That was disturbed significantly. So as a result of this threat, Iran was inducted into this axis of evil and a rogue regime, quote unquote, immediately. Axis of evil was introduced after War on Terror, but immediately after the revolution, Iran was called a rogue state. And this characterization represents Iran to have this hostility, ideologically and otherwise, to Western-led order that is intrinsic to its very being of the global capitalist imperialist order. She is therefore not necessarily to be reintegrated into the international community, but isolated and destroyed. And this logic, if you understand what is to come after the revolution from this, in this historical context and from this perspective, we understand that Iran is constantly constructed to be the enemy of the order, right? And that is the imperial capitalist order. Max Isle, and I know you've talked to him as well. Really, I love how he frames this, and I wanna borrow from him here. He views the 79 revolution as the loss of imperialism on two fronts. And he talks about how the domestic economic policy and foreign policy are part of that. Iran, after revolution, turned inwards and shifted trade to the south, right? The oil money was no longer going to weapons spending, but to university spending. It was used to partially develop the industry, develop the industry, the indigenous industry, the rural health clinics. And this shift posed a serious threat to the set of imperial relations and economic structures that has been governing Iran for decades. And such loss of imperial circuits of capital accumulation prompted the construction and reconstruction of mechanisms such as sanctions, such as covert and overt operations, which we're going to get into, to conduct again coups and regime change and color revolutions ever since that revolution.
No, thank you so much. I feel like you're doing my job for me, right? You're bringing you're raising all the points that we're gonna go into. But honestly, thank you so much for an elaborate and rich overview, which I know is no small feat. But that was, I think, that really lays the context of the Islamic Revolution vis-a-vis imperialism prior to the Islamic Revolution and also afterwards as well. I think that's an important context and that we have to speak and think through. So you mentioned the sanctions, right? I think let's take it basic and then we'll then go into more detailed. So when was Iran first placed under sanctions and what were the nature of these sanctions?
So the conventional accounts, they locate the emergence of Iranian sanctions in 79, right? They say they usually, like most 99% of the books, when you pick them up, they're like, oh, there was a 79 revolution. There was a hostage crisis, quote unquote. Students took over the Iranian embassy. They took diplomats hostage. They demanded the return of the Shah. And the reason, by the way, they often neglect the reason, but the reason was they were demanding the return of the Shah to the country to stand trial, and US refused. But this is the moment where it is introduced in mainstream narratives, where Iran was this hostile, new, barbaric, violent government and revolution that was posing a threat to the US security. So that is both misleading and inaccurate. Misleading because it excludes the important historical context prior to the 79 that we just explained, and also inaccurate because sanctions in their current form were in fact imposed on Iran after its attempt to secure sovereignty over natural resources under Mohammad Mossadegh in 51. The 51 moment, which was a call for nationalization of oil, after it succeeded, Britain froze Iran's assets and placed an embargo on Iran and banned exports of goods to Iran. The enforcement of these measures was also further ensured at the time through British military power, because the British naval ships were stationed outside of the Iranian ports, impeding oil shipments. And this significantly facilitated the 2 years that essentially Iran was embargoed, and Iranian oil, which was the sole source of income for Mossadegh's government, it was embargoed. It significantly facilitated the coup that took place 2 years later, right? The orchestrated coup by MI6 and CIA. So when we understand this is not only a simple like historical correction of, oh no, it's not this year, it's that year. When we understand this history, Iran sanctions are more associated with not so much with the Islamic Revolution because of the like Islamic nature of the revolution, but with the earlier struggles for independence and sovereignty. And this will then allow us to have a more accurate analysis of what sanctions are trying to achieve and have done to the country, not only Iran, but also outside. So associating sanctions not with this moment that happened in a vacuum, the Islamic Revolution, but with the struggles of sovereignty and independence.
Thank you so much. And I think that's an important point that you raised, that I think it's too easy of an account to say the Islamic Revolution took place. This is a quote unquote a regime that is trying to oppress people and take people's backwards. Therefore, the benevolent US is imposing sanctions. So I appreciate that response. Okay, talk me through some of the specifics of the sanctions and how do
Right.
they impact the daily lives of the people?
So let's go back to where it started, right? I mentioned briefly, but after Mossadegh, the 79 the 79 moment significantly amplified the sanctions, right? So immediately after the revolution in 79, the first comprehensive sanctions are imposed on Iran in 80. And what it did, it was through an executive order. And it essentially placed prohibition on the import of all items to Iran from the United States, the sale, supply, and transfer of any item from the US and any foreign country to Iran. So essentially, this later became known as secondary sanctions, where if US is trading with you and you trade with Iran, you're going to have a problem, right? Any shipment to Iran, financial transactions, and credit to Iran were also prohibited, and the support of industrial projects in Iran. And later, these are like the major subheadings of these sanctions, right? Any of these then will come to target a lot of individual people, individual industries, individual companies that are working in a nuclear industry, in defense industry, in a lot of indigenous sovereignty, indigenous development, in terms of agriculture, in terms of technology, in terms of AI these days. They expand, right? But these are the formation, the initial at least formation of the sanctions. But what I want to also highlight was that there wasn't only sanctions placed. So the sanctions immediately after were imposed on this fragile, newly post-revolutionary state, and there were a lot of, as you can imagine, the revolution was led by a lot of different and diverse political groups. We had socialists, we had communists, we had Islamists, we had, Bazaris and like there were a very diverse and often opposing political groups that together led the revolution. And it was in this post-revolutionary moment that a state is not solidified. The state is not fully formed. There are still contestations of power. We don't know what the revolution is gonna lead. We don't know what the country is gonna look like. Is it gonna be a socialist country? Is it gonna be? I'm not saying that it would have been or would or wouldn't have. We don't know, because immediately after revolution and when Iran was slapped with the first sanctions in 80s, we were also invaded militarily by Iraq, sponsored and supported by the West between 80 and 88. So it was immediately this fragile post-revolutionary country. A military aggression was imposed upon it. This is often omitted from English language scholarship on Iran, but it is really important to acknowledge the role of the foreign and Western influence in this conflict. The US played a role in some of the worst atrocities that were committed against Iranians during the war. This included launching some of the worst chemical attacks, and these are CIA files. These are not even Iranian accounts, but CIA files. Not to say that they hold more accuracy, but by supplying Saddam Hussein's regime with things like mustard gas, they killed a lot of Iranians. And I think the total of war was, if I'm not mistaken, 300,000 people at the end of 8 years of Iranians and soldiers and civilians were killed. So it was not only the material destruction and waste of the war to the infrastructure of the country, to the civilians, to the people, but it was also the very promise that the revolution held, just like in Mossadegh, right? The very promise that Mossadegh brought to the country. And by the way, Mossadegh was a secular. It's debated whether he was a socialist or not, but he was very much a secular, very sympathetic, strongly sympathetic to working class struggles. Mm-hmm. And they keep taking away the promises of the struggles of Iranians and the revolution through their invasions, imperialist aggressions against the country by refusing, by denying them sovereignty, by denying them the right to build the society and the country that they want, free from the terror of imperial violence. And we keep seeing that when we study the history of Iran, we keep seeing how the sovereignty was denied in very significant moments that could have changed the destiny of the entire nation, right? Whether it's 51 with Mossadegh or whether it's in 79 with the revolution. So it was a lot of things were taken away in the war and during the sanctions, which continued after war. But it was also the very promise of the revolution, which is why I always argue that Iran is not in this stage of, it's a continuous struggle of a state building that Iranians are still going through to this very date. Because, 45, 50 years is not a long, and that included entirely of this 50 years under sanctions and almost 1 decade of it under military aggression is a very little time for a state to form itself.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. So, in terms of the impact of the daily lives of people, because I know the sanctions, I've read different things. I know at one point there was certain sanctions on baby formulas and access to sanitary towels for women and such, so on and so forth. So I wanted to know, I mean, these are the accounts that I've read. So I wanted to know, like, what is the impact materially that you see on the ground? I know the world is changing, and I know Iran has great trade deals with China and other countries right now. So I suspect that alleviates some of the impact of the sanctions as well, as well as developing endogenous kind of forms of production. So I wanted to know that what, like, materially on the ground do the sanctions have, the US sanctions have on Iran?
So before answering that, I want to talk about the victimhood and the harms of sanctions as they are talked about and challenge them a little bit, because I think it's important that we challenge the assumption of victimhood that can easily be nationalized or nationally generalized, implying that sanctions impact all individuals within the target country, be that Iran or Venezuela or Cuba or what have you, leading to the misconception that Iranians are just homogenous group suffering equally under the sanctions. This generalization obscures the complexities of both the harms and the victims of sanctions in target countries. The effects of sanctions in Iran are distributed very unevenly across class and across gender lines. There exists a spectrum from those who are severely victimized, and often those are working class are at the front of that, right? And women and patients with special diseases. We're gonna get into those, and then those who are quote unquote, we call them implicit subjects, right? Those who are, if you are an Iranian, one way or another, you are impacted by the sanctions, but you could also be benefiting from them. And I talk that's part of my research. I extensively talk about that, but I don't want to get into it. But I just want to, I guess, register and make sure that when we talk about harms and victims, the impact are very unevenly distributed, and they travel into the impacts really travel into different institutions and reach people differently. So back to your question about the daily lives, I was privileged to work with an incredible group of people on the People's Tribunal on U.S. imperialism in the form of sanctions, embargoes, and economic coercive measures, where I was the co-chair. And we held over 15 country hearings about the impact of sanctions on the target countries. And one of them was, of course, Iran. And we had witnesses providing us very powerful and heartbreaking testimonies on different areas. And I want to talk about two of them here. One, we had a patient from thalassemia organization who they were talking to us about, and I encourage everyone, these are all available online on sanctionstribunal.org if you're interested in hearing these. But both thalassemia patients and also EB patients. EB patients have, a very fragile skin conditions, and they use a very special, I guess, a form of treatments that is not indigenously, or was not. I think they recently started developing that in Iran. But the companies in the West that provided those medicines refused to provide these medicines to these patients. And we had several testimonies from them. And the reason, and while sanctions narratives, and especially in the West, are accompanied by these humanitarian language where they claim that they don't include sanctions exempt humanitarian needs and medicine, that's not what is happening on the ground, right? A lot of these companies, whether it's over due to what this special rapporteur on sanctions characterized as over compliance, which I don't know if I agree with it, but it's explained as over compliance because there is risk associated with dealing with Iran and Iranian banks, because every trade, if you want to import medicine in Iran, it means that there is going to be a bank involved, there is going to be shipping companies involved, there is going to be insurance companies involved. And because maybe the actual medicine itself is not sanctioned, but the bank is, but the shipping companies are, but the insurance companies are, and they refuse to essentially conduct a trade, right? So there are a lot of complex ways that the world is unaware of when it comes to the real material impacts on the most vulnerable portions of the population in Iran. And those include the patients with special diseases that Iran has not yet developed the medicine for. But also in terms of the impact of sanctions on women, as you know, one of the very, I guess, well-known impacts of sanctions are on the economy of the target nation. That is in the form of inflation, in the forms of unemployment, in the forms of rise of, I guess, economic conditions that do not allow for people to conduct their activities as they usually would, right? The rise of a lot of cost of living, and that has disproportionately impacted women and working class women in Iran, because the very first people to give up their jobs, for example, when daycare becomes expensive, when we need someone to I guess stay at home and do the domestic job, and because we don't have money to support the family the way we used to, it's usually, and the layoffs and the unequal pays in terms of salary, the wage gap, all of these disproportionately have impacted women. And there are extensive studies that they interview women in Iran and outside to establish how the impact of sanctions has disproportionately impacted women in Iran. And these are only a few examples of this. But I also really encourage people, when they want to think about the impact of sanctions, to also move beyond these individual, I guess, impacts, which are very, very important, and we should be aware of them and take them seriously. But there is also a very structural harm that is being done to the country. And in the context of Iran, I tend to move away from, I guess, understanding or categorizing sanctions as maximum pressure of the Trump or Obama era sanctions, because they very much center the policy of the imposing country at the center of the analysis. But when I took a step back and I looked at the conditions and the I guess dynamics that were at play in Iran when these sanctions were being imposed, and what was being specifically targeted in each round, I came to this new category that I think is more productive to think about and to think through when we're talking about sanctions. And those are four major rounds and categories. I centered the question of sovereignty when I want to talk about the impact and structural harms of sanctions. And when I center sovereignty, we see that the first moment of sanctions, as I said, was imposed on the oil industry when Iran practiced its sovereignty over natural resources in 51, right? The second moment of sovereignty was when 79 revolution happened. It was the sovereignty of the country and taking back political sovereignty. And then in the 2012, starting in 2011, 2012, we see as Iran starts to develop or go back to the development of its nuclear industry sanctions, there is a vast new round of sanctions that is specifically targeting the nuclear industry in Iran. And Iran is being depicted as this threat, nuclear threat. You know, we have Netanyahu, we have others coming to the UN saying Iran is this close to building a bomb, Iran is developing a bomb, right? It's this the indigenous development and sovereignty of the nuclear industry. And then once that was given away in the JCPOA, they were able to successfully bring Iran to the negotiation table. And I have my own critical perspective on all that, which I'm not going to get into now. And then Iran starts to focus a lot on the defense industry, right? On the drones that are now an issue, on the missiles. We see the emerging of that specific industry, the defense industry, in the sanctions document. And so, with each development of indigenous development of an industry, which is in a way practicing sovereignty, moments of practicing sovereignty, we see a very new round of sanctions being imposed on Iran. And when we have this, I guess, framework and then go into looking at the details of each of these, it's fascinating to see how under human rights, for instance, human rights justification, they target people like IRGC members like Qasem Soleimani or Fakhrizadeh, Fakhrizadeh was the father of Iranian nuclear industry. You see individuals under the guise of human rights violation being targeted because of their direct involvement and impact on the development of a lot of indigenous industries that then materially threatens the imperial order in the region.
Thank you so much. And I think I'm going to combine my next two questions. Iran, like China for me, there are peculiar cases, not in and of themselves, but in the responses they elicit from those who are self-described as anti-imperialists or leftists in the West. Because the go-to kind of response to so many of these folks when they try to take an opinion on Iran or analysis of Iran and China, it's like the first thing you might hear is, but they're authoritarian, they are oppressive, they are brutal, etc., etc. And they very quickly become stenographers for the CIA. Very quickly, once you try to talk about taking an anti-imperialist, a principled anti-imperialist stance, and what that begins to sound like, and then in terms of by way of analysis. So my question is, people talk about Iran being authoritarian, oppressive to women. What do you say? And I want to couch that in, we saw the emergence of the women life and freedom movement. So who are they and what do they stand for? Can we pack them together?
Yes, I'm going to try. I guess this powerful and continuous portrayal of not only Iran, but also, as you said, China. We've seen it during, on Maduro, Venezuela, Bashar Assad in Syria, even Fidel, right? These portrayal are trying to depict Iran as this exceptional state that is not normal, quote unquote, and that its construction as the authoritarian, as the leading sponsor of terrorism or the rogue regime, these really facilitate blurring the lines between a sovereign nation state and a criminal state, if you will, outside of international law, that is then deserving and necessitates that we democratize it, right? So they work to facilitate foreign intervention, foreign imperial intervention, by exceptionalizing them. And such patterns of exclusion have been very sustained. It's not only on the Islamic Republic since 79. During the 50s, Mossadegh was also publicly described. Mossadegh, again, was a secular, right? It has nothing to do with the Islamic nature or the Sharia law or the women's rights and the hijab. It's never about that, because they have no issues with the Sharia law in Saudi Arabia or the Sharia law in UAE, right? They are more than happy to collaborate with those. But these are tactics to depict, and they did that with Mossadegh. They described Mossadegh. Mossadegh was constantly described by the British in their official documents as a dictatorship, as quote unquote crazy, as unbalanced, as absurd. Same with Ayatollah Khamenei right now, or others. Through this othering, the imperial violence of targeted sanctions, they become unseeable. The violence, and so within this othering, then we see depicting Iran as this, as I said, this extra legal subject. And woman life freedom was a manifestation, and not only manifestation, but also a continuous attempt to conduct regime change in Iran. And I don't say that to, we are, trained to qualify our analysis when we talk about these things by criticizing the government. That's not what I want to do. What I want to say is that the tragic death of Mahsa Amini in September 2022 was very quickly was a result of a lot of internal contradictions that Iran deals with, a lot of struggles that women, not only since 2022, but ever since the revolution, they've been on the front lines, women in Iran, and they've achieved a lot of progress and victories, and they continue to struggle to this very date. But this legitimate grievance, this about an internal contradiction that Iran is dealing with, was very quickly turned into this full imperialist attack that was designed and organized to achieve regime change in Iran. And we see that we're not going to wait another 50 years like the coup in 50 and Mossadegh and others for them to show us evidence. We know that by simply looking at the history. We know that by seeing how they weaponized the gaps. Mahsa Amini was targeted not because she was Kurdish, it was because she was a woman. But they, in the Western media especially, they really emphasized the Kurdish her ethnic identity as a Kurdish woman, because their policy on Iran has always been divide and conquer. And one of the ways in which they were able to do that, both during the war, Iran-Iraq war, after the revolution, and now, is to really try to divide Iran and conquer it based on its multicultural ethnicities that Iran has. Yeah, we have Kurds, we have Baluch, we have Azeris in the south, we have Arabs in the south, right? And Iran has always been this unified, ever since the revolution especially, came to protect its sovereignty as a country with all these ethnicities in it. And one of the ways, and another gap, for example, is Sunni Shia, which they've always invested in through Saudi Arabia, through Salafis, right? They always invested in these existing gaps, and women life freedom immediately turned into this imperialist assaults that we saw. I mean, it was ridiculous how literally NATO forces, they would be inviting the so-called leaders of the Women Life Freedom, like Masih Alinejad, to NATO meetings. They would be meeting with Macron, the French president. They would be meeting with Hillary Clinton. And it was for anyone who has any sort of understanding of imperialism and how imperialism has conducted its violence in Iran historically and in the present, it was not very difficult to trace at least the imperialist underpinnings of this. And it's also not accidental that many people who were active and leading the protest in Washington, in London, in Ottawa during Women Life Freedom are now at the forefront of the Zionist protest and are leading anti-Palestinian narratives in these. But also as a critique to the movement itself, even if we move beyond this, I guess, imperialist involvement in this, in the Women Life Freedom, I think it's also important to think about how Western media overlooks the fact that women's rights are primarily product of class rights, which can only be gained through anti-imperialist class struggle, right? That is not to say that like feminist agendas should be discarded, but it is to emphasize that when imperialism is about destroying developing nations to control their resources, it is the destruction that must be a stop. It is that destruction, right? These, I guess, paid peddlers miss the point that class struggle in the developing world is a struggle against the extension of the Western bourgeoisie, against Western ideological clones on the developing nation territory to aid and abet in the abstraction of their own nation. And what is always fascinating when people in the global north get excited when a protest happens in a country like Iran is the assumption that protests or protesters can never be fascist in other countries. We don't enthusiastically support fascists coming to a street and protest here, for example, in the US, right, or London. But a lot of people in the left, or a lot of so-called progressive in the left, really just assume that any sort of protest can be and have progressive cause that should be supported. But what we saw in the streets was not only a lot of violence, but also a lot of for example, Palestinian sentiments. Some of the slogans that were resurfaced in the Women Life Freedom was, for example, I witnessed the taking down of the Palestine Square sign in the street, for example, or we saw the slogan resurfaced. It was in Iran before, but people started saying "Na Gaza, na Lebanon, janam fadai Iran," which translates to "No to Gaza, no to Lebanon. My life is my life," and Lebanon being Hezbollah, "My life is for Iran." Right? We saw a lot of fascist and right-wing sentiments within this. Again, not to say that there weren't legitimate grievances and that gender equality struggles should not be progress and advanced in Iran, but to say that the U.S. imperialism in Iran really harms the struggles to progress the country, as it did after the revolution, as it did after Mossadegh. Without sovereignty, we cannot develop and build the country and the society that we want. Sovereignty is the primary condition for any sort of development that we want to see in Iran. But when that is threatened constantly, when that is under attack constantly, it is very hard to imagine that if an anti-imperialist movement can successfully achieve victory in Iran, right? Because it can very easily be hijacked. It can very easily be turned into a regime change operation. But that is not to say that it's impossible to do it, as some of the workers in Iran currently are leading, who are very aware of the anti-imperialist struggles that Iran has been through. They've been able to protect their campaign and protect their movement from imperialist aggression, which is why no one really hears about them in the West. And they've been leading campaigns for increasing minimum wage, for a lot of security in the workplace, and a lot of other demands that they have. But yeah, you never hear about them because they try to protect themselves from imperialism.
Thank you so much. And all too often you see the ways in which these forms of imperial feminisms are operationalized and mobilized to legitimate U.S. imperialism aggression against these countries. So, the thing is, I think by now people are just being deliberately obtuse. I don't know what it is. I just think people are being deliberately obtuse sometimes, because I feel like we've seen the playbook time and time again. and the characterizations of quote unquote rogue states and the demonizations of global South states, especially when they act as a bulwark against US imperialism. We've seen it time and time again, that the language that is used and people still fall for it. I get a bit like, I don't know what to say at this point. It reminds me of as Kwame Ture said when he said, if I'm the Imam of Mecca and US imperialism, American imperialism is fighting the devil, then I'm on the side of the devil.
Devil.
Like, I just feel by this point, we don't have people. I don't know. I feel like you don't have an excuse anymore. But thank you so much for that. So, well, a couple questions left. A few questions left, actually. So, how and why is Iran important for US imperialism? Or how and why is Iran, how does it fit into the equation of US imperialism?
Right. So Iran fought back against to gain its sovereignty, as I said. It's important to destroy Iran because of the disturbance that the 79 revolution caused, the flow of the imperial relations, right? The unequal imperial capitalist relations that were governing the relationship between Iran and the West. But Iran did not only do that. After the revolution, and Iran has started to find its geopolitical standing in the region, and especially after the war in 88, the war with Iraq, it realized that in order to protect its sovereignty, it needs to make sure that the region is also, as much as it could, safe and protected from imperialist and US aggression. What we need to understand Iran in the current context. We need to understand Iran being, I guess, surrounded by US military bases. It was Iraq, in Iran's neighbor in the west. It was Afghanistan, Iran's neighbor in the north and east, and all across from South and Azerbaijan right now, with its close collaboration with the Zionist entity, and in the south we have UAE, Qatar, with hosting military bases of NATO and the US. Iran is essentially surrounded by US military bases in the region. And so after the war, it realized that in order to make sure that it is never again invaded by any of these forces, it needs to go beyond its borders. And with this, a lot of this was owed to Qasem Soleimani and Qasem Soleimani's strategy and I guess ideology and resistance. So Iran was really instrumental in going into and supporting the national liberation movements and anti-colonial struggles to both strengthen them and develop them and create allies with an allyship and partnerships with them. And this materialized, as we're seeing right now, in Palestine with, different resistant forces from Hamas to Islamic Jihad in Palestine. Iran has publicly said how it materially supports them, provide them with weapons and technology to protect themselves and to fight against the Zionist colonialism. It also manifested in its close partnership with Hezbollah. Iran played a key role in really strengthening and supporting Hezbollah into becoming power that anti-colonial power and movement that it is today. And also Iran played a key role in Syria, for instance, and also in Iraq against the US invasions and against US attempts to overthrow these governments and put in place agents of US imperialism, right? And so Iran has been a central component to the current resistance movement in West Asia that we see today. And because of that, it was not only an ideological basis, but also ideological, I guess, aspects of the revolution that threatened the US, as they would like to depict, right? This Islamic Sharia backward law that we want to modernize and we want to democratize, that we want to save Iranians. No. It was very a material threat to the first of all, the colonial project of US in the region, which is the Zionist entity, and Iran poses a serious threat to its existence. It always has, and especially in this moment. And we saw that, I guess I should mention Operation Wa'ad Sadr, right? No country ever has attacked the Zionist entity the way Iran did in Wa'ad Sadr. Iran never had that capability. Iran developed this capability to defend itself and its allies from US and imperial colonial violence in the region over the past 5 decades since the revolution. So when we understand it in this context, it is only, I think the only reasonable understanding is that they are going to hijack any internal contradiction that they can, weaponize any gap in the country to make sure that they contain Iran and they overthrew or weaken it to the extent that the development is stopped and contained and impossible, right? And so Iran is truly at the heart of anti-imperialist resistance in the region, and we are witnessing that on a daily basis as we witness the liberation of Palestine coming nearer and nearer.
Thank you. And so for those of us living in the imperial core, global north, what does a principled stance, I mean, to be fair, I think throughout this episode you've done that, but let's say succinctly, what does a principled stance towards Iran sound like?
That's a great question. So I think all of that brings me to say that for those who live in the West, the primary contradiction must remain the US imperialism, because the source of all destruction and the source of all that has stopped Iran from developing itself, both economically, in terms of civil rights, in terms of human rights, in terms of women's rights, the source of all has been US imperialism. The source of all that's stopped it, right? US imperialism has been the single source of violence and de-development and wealth drain in Iran. And for anyone who is truly interested in advancing and supporting women's rights in Iran, Iranians are more than capable of doing that internally. Time and again, Iranians have shown that they're more than capable of overthrowing governments that they don't like. And Iranians should be able to build the society they want, free from the terror of imperial violence. And as long as our tax dollars and our positionalities are funding US imperialism, our job here is to fight that, is to, I guess, try and first of all be aware of how we contribute to this, and then be aware of how our understanding of these countries contribute to the, I guess, advancement of imperial causes. We don't jump on any regime change operations and pretend that they serve the interest of the Iranian people, but also, I guess, be aware of our own role in the advancement of US imperialism through media, through education, and through material war.
Thank you. And I guess a hot topic right now is the elections. I know we probably won't be able to do it justice, but briefly, what's at stake? Who are some of the front runners?
Right. It's actually a very hot and very intense campaigns right now in Iran for anyone who's following. But to give your audience just a very general idea, there are essentially, I want to say, two camps, although there have been more diverse lately. But the traditional two camps belong to the reformists, who are more liberal, pro-Westerns, those who, are always support negotiating with the West and deals like the JCPOA. Their foreign policy revolves around lifting sanctions and convincing the enemy to lift sanctions. And then we have the principalists, who are in their foreign policy different. They do have a different approach in their foreign policy. They believe in neutralizing sanctions. They don't invest, although they still pursue negotiations with West, but they are both skeptical, but also don't invest the entire foreign policy approach into that basket, right? They also explore a lot of South, and they support a lot of South-South relations, advancing relationship with China, with Russia. And they are right now campaigning for essentially like continuation of Raisi's government and his policies. And it's a close tie, especially because, and that's also another impact of sanctions. If we want to go back to that very briefly, the deteriorating living conditions under sanctions do push people when it comes to choosing a candidate that supports, and like, even though we know and we saw it doesn't materialize, you can't really deal with the West, they never hold their promises, but people want a relief from sanctions, right? So that really indirectly pushes people, and especially a lot of liberals, to push for a candidate that supports normalization with the West. And we're seeing that right now in Iran. But what we also see is not a very, unfortunately rather, different policies between the two camps on their domestic economic policies. We see, although that's changed over the past few years, but neoliberalism and neoliberal policies have been a common approach between these two camps. But that is starting to shift over the past few years, again, owed to a lot of labor movement campaigns and struggles that I mentioned earlier. We've witnessed that. We've witnessed that a lot of critical discussions around neoliberalism in Iran are gaining attraction. And we're seeing that, a lot of that in these debates as well. But yeah, the election is next week, it's on Friday, and we're going to have the new president probably Saturday. If it doesn't go to the second round, it might very well, if it's a close tie, it might go to the second round. But yeah, for anyone interested, they should follow up the news.
Thank you so much, Helyeh, for such. That was a masterclass. Thank you so much. I know this is going to be an episode that I repeatedly come back to. So the very final question, final one, and I think it would be an opportunity missed if I didn't ask this question. Who has the worst diaspora? And why?
I love this.
Don't answer it. Don't get me in trouble.
I mean, I'm biased. I'm biased.
No, thank you so much.
No, thank you.
No, absolute honor and privilege. I'm going to leave Helyeh's social media. I recommend you follow and engage, and please, I'm asking listeners or people who are first introduced to maybe this analysis of Iran is, take it in, listen, reflect on it, and we have a lot of shedding of US imperialist talking points for those of us living and have been raised in the West. Until next time, people, take care.
Thank you